everyone out there on YouTube from wherever you're coming in the world. Welcome to our event today for Accessibility Virtual Reality. I'm Thomas Logan from Equal Entry, and I'm really happy to have you all here with us today. All of the questions that you might have for today's presenter, we will be monitoring in the YouTube chat. So we thank you for joining us on YouTube, and that is where we will be taking your questions. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll also invite you to join us in Mozilla Hubs. If you are new to Accessibility Virtual Reality, we have been working with Mozilla Hubs for a while, and we will invite you to come into that space to also speak directly to our presenter today. We want to say thank you to Jolie McPhee from the Accessibility Special Interest Group of the Internet Society of New York for providing our live stream today to YouTube. And all of our talks are streamed and kept online at YouTube. So if there was a presentation in the past or today's presentation you want to go back and share with someone else, we will always have the captioned version of the presentation available on that site. And we want to say also a huge thank you to Mirror by Night for providing the captions for today's meetup. We always have human captioning at our events, and we want to make sure that we provide that as well on the YouTube stream live and also in the recording. I want to say thank you to Meryl Evans, who I work with here at Equal Entry, for helping me organize these events, and our sponsor, Equal Entry, which is our accessibility consultancy. It's a company that I work with, and I have basically focused a lot quite recently on making virtual reality accessible. Now let's move to introducing our speaker. So Deb Mayers is an ancient historian who has converted to a software engineer. And I met Deb a few years back, and we've been working together in XR Access, which is another great group if you're interested in helping contribute to the accessibility of XR going forward. We work together in the XR Access group. Deb has worked in extended reality for 6 years and accessibility for 3 years. And in her spare time, Deb creates XR experiences to learn how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. Pretty interesting. She also spoke at Augmented World Expo, AWE, and she met Meryl Evans there for the first time. So we're really excited to have Deb here today. This is a totally new presentation, something we've never discussed here at Accessibility Virtual Reality. Really excited. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Deb.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. And thank you all for letting me come and speak today. And I'll be talking about recreating the past in accessible ways. You can check out my website at Deb Mayers, so DebMayers.com, or you can find me on Twitter at DebMayers24. And all views are my own. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk about this word recreating. Now, saying reconstruction without the parentheses implies that there's a level of certainty, and we can never actually know what the past truly was like. The reconstruction with a parentheses around the re bit is showing that things aren't ever truly authentic, but it's a copy and a new object in its own right. And as Sue Greeny states in one of her papers, no reconstruction drawing of the past can do more than illustrate the state of archaeological knowledge at the time it was created. So any recreation is just imitation of the past, but ultimately it's a new construction that'll have ties to the 21st century. So anytime I say reconstruction, recreation, or something similar, I want you to remember it with this little bit of nuance. So now that we know that, let's go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to do a brief level set about the terminology that I'm using today, and then we'll talk about the 5 things I want you to take away from this talk, which are user control, high-level guidelines, change over time, multiple interpretations, and handling unknowns. Then we'll go into a Q&A afterwards. And along the way on various slides, I'll have some imagery of my work. So on this slide, there's a photogrammetry model of a lion from the Corbridge Roman town, which is in the UK. This is sitting on a 3D reconstruction that has a round fountain with water spouting out of the mouth of the lion. The Corbridge lion is one of 5 statues found at Corbridge. It has a male lion pouncing on a prey It's likely a sheep or a goat, but the prey is more of the size of a cow. So who knows what it actually is. Lions would have been a type of funerary monument. So it's likely that this was originally a funerary monument, but when it was found in the largest residence house at Corbridge, and the teeth were cut out. And so we know that it had a fountain spout coming out of it. This lion has a tremendous history, but I also wanted to just work on some water effects inside of VR. So that's why my recreation has this water effect on side of the fountain. So now I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Deb. I'm an accessibility technologist and an AR/VR engineer. I have a master's in information technology, a master's in ancient cultures, and a classical civilization bachelor's degree. So this means I have 11 years experience in studying the ancient world, 6 years experience in XR, and 3 in accessibility. So hopefully I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, but by my nerves, you wouldn't be able to tell that. And now on the screen, we also have another image of something that I've done recently, which was from one of my master's degrees. So this was a recreation of the Mithraeum, which is located at Carabroth on Hadrian's Wall in England. So for this one, what's happening is the user is inside of this 3D space. You're looking at the cult image, which is the what we call a terracotta, or the cult slaying or the bull slaying statue. It's a flat relief. Well, it was carved, but it is in a rectangle shape. And underneath it is 3 different altars. And there's just this horrendous, I'll say horrendous, coloring of the walls inside of this temple. So we're looking at the apse, looking at the altars and this cult statue, and the walls are in different patterns of. So there's a pattern of repeated red rectangles with white borders and green at the top, and then on the top of the Mithraeum there is the yellow colored ceiling with different stars, which kind of is like a space, well, a map of the universe, we'll say. So we have this great reconstruction of this archaeological site, which we'll actually get more into later on. So now you know a little bit about me. Let's do a quick level set. So when I say XR, I mean augmented, mixed, virtual reality, anything in between or beyond. The X is really just any variable. I also like when Scarborough, Smith, and Witten use the term matrix-like virtual environment, and that's still included in that whole X as a variable umbrella. Now, when I refer to disability, I mean that disability can occur to anyone, anytime, anywhere, because we have permanent, temporary, and situational disability. So I am, sorry, I have something running in my background that I will turn off. So when I talk about permanent, temporary, and situational disabilities, permanent is like me. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and that's not going away anytime soon. And temporary is also like me when I had vision issues because my blood sugars were going crazy at one point in time. And I really benefited from using magnification software on my computer. And situational, again, like me, when I'm one of those people who's very competitive. So I carry all of my groceries in from the car to my flat. But I never remember that I have to figure out a way to open the door to my flat. So disability can occur to anyone, anytime, anywhere. And we also have the social model of disability, where it's saying that the restriction is caused by society by not being inclusive. So whenever we build things, we want to make sure that we're building them inclusively, so that way we can include everyone. Now that you know all about me, let's get into the main bits of this topic. So the first thing I want you to remember is user control. This is allowing the user to be in control of different parts of experiences to help them operate the experience. Then we want to go into high-level guidelines. And these are really just some quick guidelines to think about when you're building experiences. These 2 are really related to the accessibility of the experience. The next 2, change over time and multiple interpretations, really relate to the ancient past. So change over time, everything changes. We want to make sure that our 3D reconstructions do as well. And multiple interpretations. Our views of the past have changed considerably over time. what we think today isn't necessarily what we thought in the 1800s and even further back. So we need to consider about how we consider different ideas inside of our reconstructions. And finally, number 5, handling unknowns, which really underpins both recreating the past as well as building accessible XR experiences. So let's go ahead and get started with user control. Now, when I talk about user control, what I'm really talking about is settings and using a settings cog. On the screen, I have an example from Gears 5, which has an accessibility menu specifically, and highlighted as a colorblind mode option. And when we're thinking about these settings, we want a lot of, well, we kind of want a lot of settings to change. We want the ability to change things like colors, text size, locomotion methods, whether it's a seated or standing mode, the input methods, the verbosity of a narrative, where it can be a quick experience or something much longer and more in depth and detail. We want to be able to change the background noises and animations, so be able to turn those off. We want to be able to have captioning and language, and ideally be able to change the different sizes and the text sizes, the colors of our captioning as well. And we also want to change the sensitivity of the camera. So if you're following someone, making sure that that camera has a good enough follow with the user, so that way they're not getting sick as they're going through the experience. Now, of course, settings can also be app level, but they can also be global level. So if I'm changing the text size on my VR headset, I should expect that to be able to change inside my application itself. So I shouldn't really need to be able to change inside the application, but it's always good to have that extra bit inside of it too. So now let's talk about high-level guidelines. Now on the screen here, we have an example of one of Rough Castle, which is a Roman fort on the Antonine Wall, which is up in Scotland. This is one of its most distinctive features, and this is a group of lilia, or lily pits, to the north of the fort. These lilia pits were a type of defensive measure. Each pit would have been fitted with a sharpened stake. It was pointed upright and hidden kind of among some brushwood. The pits would have served as the ability to break up attacks from the north before invaders reached the fort. Now, this is one of the first reconstructions I ever did, and this was not in 3D. This is just doing some photo effects. I personally don't see how these would actually be very effective in a Roman fort, but that's why we need high-level guidelines to be able to make sure that our 3D experiences and our Roman forts are built correctly and able to withstand our attacks or our users. So let's first talk about visual guidelines. So we want to be able to display text on a background and at a suitable distance. So really no closer than 0.5 meters away. This helps with the ease of reading. And we also want to be able to make sure that you're able to have that background so that way you can easily view the text. And speaking of viewing the text, we really want to make sure that our color contrast is at least 4.5 to 1. You can do a lot stronger because remember what you're doing is you're putting text in front of objects in the real space or inside of a 3D reconstructed space. So we want to make sure that that contrast is there. And we want to be able to change text size and typography. And we want to be thinking about this as we're creating the experience as well. Should we be using a let's say a 12-point font? Probably not, but the user can still be able to change their text size as well. And we also need to be able to limit flashing and blinking content and be able to turn off background noise and content as well. So things that don't matter, especially for the experience, being able to just toggle that on and off can help tremendously with when people are inside the experience. And we want to make sure that interactable objects are large enough to see and interact with. This could also be something like having a large focus ring as your hand goes over the object itself. And then we also want to start thinking about audio descriptions. Now, I haven't really seen anyone quite do this, I would say, do this in the best way possible yet. It's still an area where we're testing out different things. But I think when we're thinking about audio descriptions, being able to toggle from modes like having a normal audio description, a verbose, a quick, or setting some type of delay of when to hear the description could be helpful. And again, I don't think anyone's really cracked the code on this one, but just some things to think about. Now, we also need a non-visual way to know when something's interactable. So you can use things like that audio description or the quick and long descriptions, but when you're putting this information in, make sure that you add important information first. So if I am on a Roman fort and I'm about to grab a coin, I probably just want to say it's a coin of whomever the coin is about, rather than saying this is a coin from the 2nd century that has XYZ. I want to make sure that the information is given to the user quickly so that way they can understand what they're interacting with. Now, our next things to think about are audio guidelines. So with audio guidelines, we want to make sure that important sounds are displayed with text and or haptics. Ideally, a good mix of the two, but I think, again, users should be able to change whether they want text to be able to see whatever the sound is or haptic control as well. Captions should be displayed appropriately and allow the user to change the different font size, the colors, how many lines, and the verbosity. And we should also start thinking about sign language and hand tracking. While hand tracking might not be the best thing right now, it will probably get much better in the future. So being able to actually use sign language inside of AR and VR is going to be really interesting and helpful in the future. And we want to make sure that we have transcripts available for users. And something I always come back to is, I wonder if we can use haptics for Braille. So that way, if someone who is deafblind and who's using Braille inside of an experience, will they be able to interact fully inside of it? I'm not really sure how this would necessarily work, but if anyone's tried an experience with this, do let me know, because I'm so curious to see if that works. Now, we also want to think about being able to change our audio settings. So things like having mono audio and spatial audio, and being able to change the volume of background noises and the speaking volumes, and making sure those are independent of the system volume itself. Then we want to go into mobility guidelines. So we want to make sure that we have an accurate scale of the user and that they're able to change their camera height and their arm length. So that way, whenever they're inside the experience, they're able to view it in the best way possible. Now, we also want to make sure that we have seated, standing, and room scale experiences, but make sure that there are ways to change between those 3 modes. And we want to make sure that when we're using our controllers, that we can have a one-handed mode and that the user should be able to change their handedness. So whether right hand or left hand, being able to pick that dominant hand. We also want to make sure that we use multiple inputs. So things like keyboard, the controllers, hands, hand tracking, eyes, voice, switch devices, and eventually more of our BCI, our brain computer interfaces. But at least having 2 or 3 inputs is super key for this, because not everyone can hold controllers for very long periods of time. And not everyone can use their voice or use their eyes in order to change the information on the screen. So being able to have multiple inputs is very essential. And then we also want to just, again, have a good target size. So if someone's hand is shaking, you can smooth that out in the XR experience by having larger targets for interactable objects. You can also do some trickery in C# in order to, or whatever language you're using, in order to be able to grab something when you're close to it, like a magnet. So now that we know about our guidelines and we know about our user control, let's start talking about the past. So the first thing we're going to talk about, change over time with the Parthenon. Now, if you search the Parthenon on Google, you'll have a great many information about recreations of the Parthenon, but they're all either ruins or how the Parthenon might have looked in the classical period, in this ancient Greek period. Now, the Parthenon, though, it isn't just these 2 types of time periods that we see on the screen here, with the ruins or what it would have looked like in ancient Greece and in the classical period. It has a rich, rich history. So let's dive into that just a little bit. So in the archaic period, we have the 3rd temple of Athena Polis being built. And then we have a Persian sack of the Acropolis. I bet you didn't know about that Persian sack of the Acropolis, because that's never in anything that I read about the Parthenon. And then in the classical period, from 480 to 322 BC, we have Athena Promachios, or the bronze Athena being erected. We have the Parthenon being built. We have the golden Athena being dedicated as well. We have then an earthquake. And then we have Spartans being stationed on the Acropolis in 404, which that's kind of the end of our classical period. And then when we get to the Hellenistic period, we have Lachares stripping Athena of her gold to be reused, which again, not something you usually see inside of these reconstructions of the great golden Athena being stripped of that gold and just a statue itself. And then we have Sulla capturing the Acropolis. We have a portrait of Hadrian in the Parthenon, so the Roman Emperor Hadrian. And then we have Julia Domina portraits in the Rectheon and in the Parthenon. Then we have a sack of Athens, the Parthenon burns, and the second Athena sculpture is destroyed. And again, that's not shown in our reconstructions. And then we have the late Roman period from about 330 AD to 582. The Parthenon is repaired. Athena Parthenos III is installed. We have the bronze Athena moved to Constantinople. Athena, the Parthenos III, was removed and destroyed. Then we have destruction of Athens to end that period. And then we get into the High Byzantine period, where we have the Parthenon was actually converted into a church of Our Lady of Athens. And then we have the mob destroying the Athena in Constantinople. And there's a great quote about it being a drunken mob. And then we have the Frankish Florentine period from about 1204 to 1456 AD, where the Parthenon becomes a Latin church. And then we have the Turkish era, which will also bring us up to today, from 1456 to 1834, and then further on. So we have the Parthenon gets converted into a mosque. The Venetians besiege the Acropolis. The Parthenon's blown up. A small mosque afterwards is built on the floor of the roofless Parthenon. Elgin removes the Parthenon marbles, which is still a big issue that we have going on today. We have the besieging and the capturing of the Acropolis. Then we have another besieging and recapturing of the Acropolis. And then the Acropolis is surrendered. And finally, in 1834, we have the Acropolis being declared as an archaeological site. And today we have the ruins being having the scaffolding on to be put back into better shape. We don't see that in those reconstructions, do we? Did you know that the Parthenon had such a rich history? And who decides which time period is better to show? Usually when we create 3D models of sites, we do have a budget and limited resources to create an experience. But it's always important to think about what we're representing and ensuring at least we have some sort of information somewhere about the change over time. Related to this, on screen I have an example of the Parthenon as it was being built with wooden scaffolding. Then I have the classical Parthenon, which is gleaming white with its flawlessly painted sculptures. Then there's an example of the Parthenon with its minaret. And finally, we have how it stands today as a ruin with some scaffolding. But one thing that's similar across the first three images is that it doesn't really look lived in. Yet we know that this place would have been really active, especially for things like the sacrifices, right? Where the smoke would be billowing, we have animals all around. How could it look so pristine and not lived in at all? I mean, I don't know about you, but have you ever had a dirty hand and you wiped it across your keyboard or your screen and you have a big smudge? I'm sure there were smudge marks on the temple, but you never see that in these reconstructions. And it's not the cleanest area. So we need to make sure that we're starting to think about these things as we're building reconstructions, which brings us to multiple interpretations. So for multiple interpretations, As Hewitt once said in the reference to the archaeology of the Acropolis, what's one archaeologist's hut is another's rubbish pit. We're never going to know what the past was exactly like. So we need to show our guesses, the inconsistencies, and where we fill information in. And on the screen, I have my favorite museum label I've ever seen, which is at the Museum of Gloucester. And it says, Mystery Head. Some archaeologists believe that this head is of a Celtic god carved in the Iron Age about 2,000 years ago. Others think it's a garden ornament from the 20th century. And if that doesn't sum up archaeology and history in just a nice little nutshell, I don't know what else would. Because we never really know. We're going to have two divergences of thought. And we need to make sure that when we're building these reconstructions, that we're able to show this really well. Because as we change our thoughts over time, based on our current knowledge of history and archaeology, we want to make sure that we are able to change our recreations as well. And there's now this example of what this Celtic head that we don't know if it's 2,000 years old or if it's from the 20th century, I'll show here on screen. And it's kind of just an ugly, well, I say ugly, it's also endearing, right? It's in the shape vaguely of a head with kind of some shoulders. You have the eyes carved out and the mouth carved out, but really it's just a hunk of stone, essentially, is what it is. But still, my favorite museum label to talk about multiple interpretations. And not only just multiple interpretations, but we really don't know. I mean, there's some things we can do with dating, but we don't know if this was 2,000 years old or from the 20th century. So how do we handle that too? Well, a great example of this is this Mithras sculpture, which is at the British Museum. So here we have Mithras slaying the bull. We also have a new thought, a new group of thought where it's not actually slaying the bull, but he's actually wounding the bull. So Mithras is a god from the Roman world. He is holding the bull by its mouth with a knee on its back. And there is, he has a dagger in one of his hands and he is slicing the bull just above its shoulder blade. And then we have a dog and a snake lapping at the blood. And we have a scorpion as well, because it shows kind of the different constellations in the sky. But with this sculpture, there's so much that we actually don't know, because there's a lot of pieces that we're actually missing. So now I have in blue the bits of the sculpture that actually weren't there, and they were just completely redone in order to build what we have today. So it's missing the entire cape of what Mithras has on his back. His head was missing, his arms were missing, the dagger was missing, the front bit of the dog was missing. But today we see everything in stone. And really it's not accurate, because we know that Mithras usually wouldn't look up, looking out. He'd instead be looking at the bull. So this interpretation is actually not correct. And well, okay, it could be correct, but based on all the other similar iconography shown with Mithras, probably not correct. But still, when you put it in stone, you think that first image of him looking out and everything there, you think, oh yeah, this is something that the ancient people would have looked at. But really, probably not. And there's also another example. Again, from the British Museum, we have another Mithras sculpture. And this one here, we have Mithras again in his slaying the bull or wounding the bull. And here we have him looking down at the bull this time, so that's good. But again, this one is actually worse in how much was missing. So we have almost the entire upper body of Mithras gone, including his arms, his head, his cape, his upper torso. And we also have, again, missing is the dagger. So is what we see currently inside the museums correct, or do we just have to put, sorry, Ian, please. So we just need to figure out what we can show and how to handle those unknowns. And this actually relates to looking at accessibility as well, because how do you handle our unknowns about people? So inside of museums, especially, and if we're looking at putting XR into museums, we have a great group of people who gather at these exhibits. So on the slide, I have an example of the crowd that's just jam-packed looking at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and just people after people, and trying to get an image of that of that painting. And then we have the same thing in the British Museum, looking at the Rosetta Stone. So how can we use XR inside of a museum, and how can we do it when we don't really know how to handle certain situations for people? Like, how do you handle making sure that people can hear an experience when they're standing in a museum that either they have to be super quiet in, and maybe they don't have headphones? Or what about when there's a ton of people around all rustling, and you're not able to use your phone with AR? Lots of unknowns to happen there. So now that we know about these 5 main things, let's go ahead and go into some examples of the work that I've done. So first up, I'm going to give you an example of the statue of Marcus Aurelius. So this is a bust that's in the North Carolina Museum of Art. Marcus Aurelius was one of the Roman emperors from the Antonine period, and I did a photogrammetry model of this bust, and I was really interested in how we can look at different skin tones and different hair colors and different colorings of the different clothing that people are wearing inside the busts, because we know that these sculptures would have been painted. We don't necessarily know how they were painted, or we don't know what skin tones people had. So just playing around with that was something I was really interested in. So I have 3 different recreated Marcus Aureliuses here. The first is with a dark hair as well as a darker skin tone. The second one is I tried to do sort of a salt and pepper sort of feel. I wasn't very good at trying to map the textures onto the model, so lots more gray than I was hoping to go for. But again, with darker hair and a darker skin tone. And the third example is with brown hair and a lighter skin tone. So how can we do this in an accessible manner at a museum itself? So being able to give things like alt text on here is going to be key. And then also, is there something that we can do with different senses? Maybe different haptic vibrations, or maybe, I don't know, maybe using scent to show the different interpretations of the statue as you go across the 3 different recreations. Then the next example I have is of the car Broth Mithraeum. So this again is on Hadrian's Wall inside of England. So I have a photo of me standing next to the 3 altars as you're looking into the apps. And then I have an example of what it looks like today as a ruin. So there's a few coursings of stone in a rectangular shape. You can see the 3 altars at the apse of the temple. And then there's also a sculpture of I think it's either Cautes or Catapates, who are the 2 different torchbearers who would have been there as well. So it's just a statue of that at the temple. Now, when we recreate this, there was a great piece in the archaeological report that said we found a piece of plaster that was red and green with no discernible pattern. So me thinking, well, red and green, so that must mean the walls are red and green, but how do you display that? What I did was I just created some pattern, didn't really have a rhyme or reason, and I put that on the walls. And then I knew that the cult statue as well would have been painted. So again, I painted it based on different examples that we've seen across the Roman Empire. But is it correct? Maybe, maybe not. And the altars themselves as well, they would have been painted. They did have some remnants of paint, but not a ton. So I just did my best there as well. So some of the things that we need to think about here, the first thing was this experience has a flickering light and fast camera movement. I'm going to play a really quick video clip of this experience. So please look away while I do this. I will let you know as soon as I am done with this. But again, it is flickering light and fast camera movement. So please look away if it'll be effective. So I'll count down from 5. Please look away during that time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And again, please look away if flickering light and fast camera movement are a bother for you. So we'll go ahead and play this example. So we have the God speaking to the user. So he's saying, hello, Marcus. Marcus is the name of one of the people who dedicated the altar at the temple. He's giving the user a little bit of background information about the fort, about the religion. And then a torch gets lit, and then you're supposed to take the torch and light the different torches inside the temple in order to get more information. So we have here now, we're lighting the first torch, we get that information. If we go a little bit further along, we go inside of the temple, we light more torches, we can see different examples of what that recreation looks like, where we can see that Caudes and Catopade statues that are currently at the site. But again, they would have been painted, they would have been fully there. Today they're sitting in ruin. We have the altars fully functioning and together, whereas today, again, they're a little bit more in ruinous state. And we have the cult statue here as well. But okay, now I'm done showing that video. So again, you can come back on if you did need to avert your eyes. So some considerations for this experience was, firstly, it was extremely dark. Secondly, it had that flickering light and no way to turn that off. Thirdly, I didn't have any captions. Now, the god of this experience was actually someone I got to play while I was doing my degree. He was from Northern Ireland, and he had a very thick accent. So one of the pieces of comments that I got during this was that, number one, oh, I'm not a native English speaker, and I had extreme difficulties understanding what he was saying. So having captioning and translation would have helped me out a lot there. And there was really limited ways of interacting. You could teleport or you could walk around the experience, but really it wasn't the best way to go forward. We also had not many haptic sensations. So as the user was going to different torches around the temple, they didn't get a vibration to let them know that, hey, there's something here you can interact with to get more information from the god. And I didn't have any audio description. This is a really rich, vibrant visual site, but you can't really get that information if maybe you can't get into the VR headset and to look around it. So making sure that would be there would be very key. And it only shows a temple in one time period. I was using the 3rd century AD layout, but it actually had 3 different layouts, and it was destroyed in 350. But you get none of that information from this experience. And it also just shows my interpretation of the painted iconography. And I don't call that out. So making sure that I start thinking about this more from the beginning would have been essential. One of the things I did do that I'm proud of is I changed it from being a standing and free roaming situation where you had the room scale and you were walking around to a seated example, because I did put it on a 3DOF headset at one point. So I did do a good job on that one, but there's so many more things that I should have done. And now that I'm looking at redoing this and doing it a little bit better from an archaeological reconstruction perspective, I'm really starting to think about this right now. So now let's go ahead and we'll go to the next thing. So my current use case of using AR and VR is, how can we read hieroglyphs inside of museums? Now, for those who don't know, hieroglyphs are a pictorial form of ancient Egyptian writing. This was really used by the elite inside of a lot of just different funerary contexts or the royal context. And on the screen, I have an example of a false door, which is inside of the North Carolina Museum of Art. And for this one, again, I did a photogrammetry model of the door, and then I started to color in on different things of the door. So I have an example of where all I have highlighted are different names that are inside the door. Another example is just everything that I was looking at. And then the third example of this photogrammetry model and recreation is the different names of the gods and their epithets. So looking at how can we use AR and VR to read hieroglyphs in an accessible manner is something I am currently looking into. I don't have all the answers for it, but I did want to share it today because I just love this use case. Now, hieroglyphs are usually, they're a very haptic sensation when you look at the stelae. So either they are put into the stone itself or they're brought out. So they would have, if you would put your hand over the stelae, you'd be able to feel the hieroglyphs. Now, I think that's going to be important as we go on, but before we get to that point, let's think about one of my favorite stelae that we have. Now, this is at the Met Museum, so in New York, and this is the stelae of Deju and his wife Setsobek. This is at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from the 18th dynasty. And on the placard at the museum, it states, this Middle Kingdom stela belonged to Deju and his wife Setsobek, who carries a mirror similar to those others found in tombs. Which doesn't really give you too much information about the stelae, but online we do have a fuller description. So it says the 2 lines of inscription at the top of this rectangular stela indicate that the monument belongs to a man named Deju, born of Seni, and his wife Setsobek, born of Nefret. In the center of the large scene, Deju is shown striding forward around over the ground line that's painted in 3 colors. He holds a walking stick in one hand and carries a shorter stave with an upturned end in the other. His jet black hair is short, he spouts a small goatee on his chin, and he wears an ornate broad collar, bracelets, and a short kilt with a triangular front panel. Setsobek stands to the left, placing one hand on her husband's shoulder and holding a mirror with a papyrus-shaped handle on the other. Her long tripartite hair is as black as Deju's, and she is shown wearing a close-fitting green dress with a single shoulder strap. A broad collar, bracelets, and anklets complete her attire. In front of Deju and Setsobek are food offerings, starting at the bottom with a large pottery beaker capped with a conical stopper and placed on a low stand, which is painted in molted pattern, perhaps to imitate something. Now we have above this is a vessel which has plucked duck on a green table laden with loaves of bread and various cuts of meat. Although the items appear to float vertically, they are meant to be seen arranged by side. And this low, flat, raised relief style is seen on the stela is characteristic of the period of transition between the Dynasty 11 and Dynasty 12. Whew, that's a lot more information than you get when you're in the museum. So that's a really rich, vibrant description of the stela itself. And I think we can benefit from this type of a description when we're starting to think about audio description and how we can use AR and VR to be able to describe these different artifacts. So let's start with reading the hieroglyphs first. So we're going to go off on this first line of hieroglyphs. So what I'm going to do here is I'll give you the transliteration, which is basically taking that pictorial form, putting it into some type of writing that we can more easily understand. That's the first bit of how we translate ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then after we do this transliteration, we then do our translation, which is putting that transliteration into English. So we'll go ahead and we'll start here. So we have Emma, hair, ta, soker, did you, mesen, seni. So we have all of these bits, Emma, hair, ta, so the name of the god, soker, did you, mesen, and seni. And then again, this means the revered one before Ptah, Soker, Deju, born of Seni. Then we have our next line of hieroglyphs, which is Emahet, hair, hot hair, Sat Sobek, Meset, and Nefret. So this means the revered one before Hathor, Sat Sobek, born of Nefret. Now, all of this is all in a relief style where if you ran your finger over it, you'd be able to feel each individual pictorial form of the hieroglyphs. So how can we make this accessible? Now, here I'm going to show you again the entire stela with the proper transliteration and translation. So we have this stela and we have this pictorial representation of a language that we then transliterate and then translate. And how can we do that in an accessible way? Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is we can use haptics to be able to read over it, kind of like what you do for Braille, but you're actually able to feel the sensation of what that pictorial form would be like. And when we're starting to think about how do we pronounce this, well, we don't even know if we're pronouncing ancient Egyptian correctly anyway, due to the different issues that we have with going down the line of the language. So how can we do that in different ways? And again, if anyone has any ideas on how you can make reading Egyptian hieroglyphs accessible, do let me know. My big revelation was that of using haptics and being able to see, okay, well, can we use this as a way to be able to understand what this would have said, especially for people who might be blind, low vision, or who might not process visual information as easily as, say, doing something with their hands. So that's my fun bit of doing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs inside of XR. So again, we want to think about these 5 things: user control, high-level guidelines, change over time, multiple interpretations, and handling unknowns. All of these are going to be essential when we're thinking about recreating the past using AR and VR. So as we're going along, make sure that you're thinking about these things and documenting everything we do, because others will benefit from the work that you're doing currently as well. So with that, I will end my talk, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you, Deb, so much. That was extremely interesting, and you made me think about a ton of things that I've definitely not thought about before. I love the Parthenon example and the reconstruction examples too, of just thinking about reconstruction versus construction. It's very interesting. And also, I've got to give a shout out to you as, Mom of the Year, for being able to maintain composure and give a great presentation. I think this is a master class in staying so focused. You did an awesome job. So we're going to switch to some questions now, Deb, if that's all right. And I think these might be a little hard questions, but they're interesting. The first question we had was photogrammetry, like making it accessible, or any ideas for best practices about just the process of, photogrammetry. And
Ooh, so do we mean like the actual taking the pictures and then the software, or do we mean the created models once we do the model itself?
I guess if you could talk to both of those, or yeah, I don't.
So I don't know the best way to do it, because what photogrammetry is you take a photo of an artifact. Well, I only do it with artifacts, so this is where I'm going to speak to, at different angles as well as different distances. So that way you have a full 3D representation in 2D photographs, and then you put it into some software. The software itself, I haven't found a great accessible version. So a lot of them you tend to be able to, you can't really use the keyboard on them. The one that I use is, it's called PhotoScan. And I can't remember who, I think it's Agisoft is who it's by, but it's not like you can, so when you're selecting the different point clouds inside of it, you tend to delete them to get rid of any extraneous noise. So if you're in a museum, what happens is as you're creating this photogrammetry model, you're also getting a lot of background information, which you tend to just try to delete as much as you can before you create the proper 3D model. But I haven't really seen a great accessible example of that. But it would just be trying to figure out which software is the best, I think, from that side. And then I think after that, one of the biggest issues I see with photogrammetry is it just creates tons and tons of polygons, which has a big issue when you're looking into, okay, how can I then take these polygons and add different colors to them? So I find that when we're doing that, it makes a bit of an issue. So it makes doing these multiple interpretations, handling unknowns a little bit more difficult. But what I usually do is I add some metadata. Well, I say metadata. What I do is usually just add in like little notes to my model and say, hey, this is the model of Marcus Aurelius. This took like 300 photographs, 15 hours of processing power, whatever it is. This would have been Marcus Aurelius when he was the Roman emperor, and this is where it was found. So trying to just add in that little extra information for that model itself, which I think also kind of works as a sort of alt text for the model.
Yeah, and I think that would be interesting to maybe as a follow-up to this presentation, but the tool that you mentioned, maybe it's something we can, as a group, advocate for them to be thinking about this scenario, right? So that they have an idea. Another question, actually, this is my question, and it came from, I'm gonna not remember the name. It began with an M, but you were showing the reconstruction of the sort of the statue missing the head. And, so this is what we have in today's world, and then this is the imagined part. Do you have any ideas of like labeling, the authentic part versus the imagined part?
So I think this is a lot easier to do in XR. So this was a Mithras, who is the Roman god. Now, with these, so I do hate to burst your bubble, but a lot of things that you see in museums have been reconstructed to some point. So usually, if you look really closely at sculptures, you'll usually be able to see like glue marks. Well, not glue marks, but you'll be able to see where they were put back together. So fun thing to go do if you have a day off and you just want to go look at how they put these back together. But I think one of the ways that you can do it is by ghosting things, which was just having the reconstructed bit being a different color or a little bit lighter, more transparent. That's one way to do it visually. Another way is that, of course, that you have to label everything out and say, okay, this is the reconstruction of Mithras. Here's everything that is original. Here's what's not original. Here's what we don't know. And a lot of this is a lot of documentation. I find that either ghosting it or having different models that you can switch between. So I find this is why it's easier in XR, is because you can take a model and you can say, okay, this is what I think it's going to be like. Now let me swipe to the next model, a little bit different, next one, a little bit different again. So having all those different interpretations and having the user pick which one they like the best to see at that point in time.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. I guess I've just never thought about that concept. And then that's so interesting that you could really show the part of it stays solid and then other parts swap out. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's cool. All right, one more question. This was, I think, related to, you were talking about the multiple interpretations. So I think this is going more in like a web context, but would it be better to create multiple alternate text of multiple interpretations, or put all the interpretations into a single alt text?
Oh, I feel like this is difficult because it's a personal preference as well. I personally would put them into multiple different alt texts, just because then if you get to one and you go, oh, I really don't want to hear anymore, you can swipe through easily. And you can kind of like speed up your screen reader if you want to, so that way you don't have to listen to everything carefully, or go at a faster speed to go through them. So I'd probably do multiple different texts. You can do it as one, but again, it's a really lengthy process if you're starting to think about, okay, here's this sculpture. It was created this way. Here's what colors I'm adding to it. Here's what time period it was. Then we go to change over time and we go, okay, here again, you have a lot of repeated information. So you can repeat the information, or you can have a description, I think, as well at the forefront saying like, okay, we're going to show you this sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. There's going to be 4 different images of this. And then you can just say what in each one with the created beat is, so you don't have to repeat that information every single time.
No, and that's awesome. I'm curious, is there any site that works like that now, or is that more like something that would need to be built?
I think you'd have to build it out. I haven't seen one yet, but it'll be a thing in the future, right? That's what we're building now.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think that's really great, and I think that's something to. It's like another scenario for description of, the idea that there's. I mean, there would already be that idea, I guess, for every image that it could be described multiple ways, but to think about it more in that context of like, you can't know, so you need to produce multiple descriptions. Yeah, I think what you said makes sense, like having the ability to like cut off a description if it's not something related to you. You're like, let me hear the next one. That makes sense to me. It's cool. All right, well, we're gonna just say this is the last question, and we're like at our time today. So we want to just thank you so much, Deb, for your presentation today. We will be providing to everyone that came to Deb's presentation today, we'll be providing a recap and hyperlinks to some of the videos that were shown in today's presentation in our recap of the presentation. We want to say thank you again to Mira by Night for the captioning today, and to Jolie McPhee for our wonderful live stream. We thank you all for joining us on YouTube. We already have our next event planned for November, and we will be sending out that invite shortly if it's not even already up. I also want to say thank you to Meryl Evans for helping me organize this event. And for today's presentation, because we're right at time, I think we are going to be closing, and we'll see you maybe in the future at the next event in Mozilla Hubs. But we thank you all for joining us today, and yeah, hope to see you in November. And thank you again, Deb. Excellent presentation.